Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. We warmly welcome you to the MMM set, that is, to Machku. My guest this evening is Colonel Maciej Korowaj, and welcome, Maciej.
I welcome you all, and I welcome you, Maciej.
And we are on the Kapitan Lisowski channel, and I hope the topic will interest you because a war of great masses is a war of great masses. Great operations are great operations, meat assaults are meat assaults, but every army and every force for now tries to have what is always considered to be precise as a scalpel, effective as you never know what, and always dangerous if used well. So we are talking about special forces. The special forces of the Federal Russian Federation are not a small thing. I remember that even before the outbreak of this war, we talked about how many VDV, that is airborne troops considered the elite of the Russian army, they suffered heavy losses, were used for the most difficult tasks in the toughest sectors. We talked about this many times with Maciej, but the esprit de corps that functioned there at that time allowed for a relatively quick appeal to reservists to report for the purpose of reconstituting those units, and they were not only reconstituted, but also new ones were created, or larger tactical formations were started to be formed from existing ones. A few years before the war, there was talk that the Russians had 30,000 soldiers in the airborne troops, and this was increased as a plan to 40,000. That was how many there were supposed to be. No other country has as many airborne troops, which may not strictly be a whole as special forces, but that is primarily where soldiers for special forces are recruited from. And the special forces were something separate. Of course, everyone immediately thinks of Spetsnaz, but it's not just Spetsnaz. So there are more events here, but no one has as many. But can it end somehow? Like a pencil when it is sharpened too many times? Not necessarily. And Maciej will talk about this today as well, because it is necessary. We need to be able to assess the resources of a potential opponent. And Russia is constantly rattling its saber, whether conventional or nuclear, seeing us in a certain role. And we must listen to all of this, draw conclusions, and arm ourselves and prepare accordingly, because it is necessary just in case. And regarding the special forces, which are very dangerous, I will also remind that the Polish army as well, we have really expanded the potential of our special forces. There are now a number of units, and they have a really good, if not very good, reputation among allies. I hope that this, one of our specialties, our army, will also be adequately strong, well-funded, equipped, and trained so that it can face its counterparts at a potential opponent. However, unfortunately, during today's conversation, we will find out how much of this the Russians will have in the near future. And this is not just a trivial matter. And now I pass the microphone to you, Machku, after this introduction, so that you can tell us where it is, what it is like, where it came from, how much there is, and what its potential is.
Special Operations Forces SOF, that is the official name, is a very interesting structure. It has changed a bit from what it was during the USSR. Here, even though you will help Maciej, previously special units were under the main management of regulations, intelligence from the GRU, and it was the structure that managed special operations. And it made sense because special units without intelligence and informational support are simply blind fighters and could not carry out their operations. This later changed during the collapse of the Soviet Union. Of course, some units remained in the GRU and had a quasi-special character, but they did not have the quality of special forces that special units had in the West. And here the Russians began to spy particularly on the Italians, especially the French, and it was created during General Junim's time. Who was the creator?
Yes, Junim. So currently, let's remember, a man who is one of two personal assistants.
He is in short, of modern special forces. Of course, the main command also had special units within its competence. In general, every institution had special units, the so-called Spetsnaz. I'm not even mentioning the Spetsnaz of the Ministry of Internal Affairs or the National Guard, as that is a completely different story. But there is Spetsnaz for strategic missile forces, military Spetsnaz, airborne troops, and naval Spetsnaz. Here, there are two types of Spetsnaz, reconnaissance and diversion, as they are two separate branches. There is, of course, Spetsnaz of the Federal Security Service, Spetsnaz of the Foreign Intelligence Service, and of course there is also Spetsnaz of the Main Directorate plus reconnaissance units. There were a lot of them, but these forces were so dispersed, large, but scattered, that there was no coordination of such strategic command. Moreover, to help conduct the war, during the times of Junin and the late head of military intelligence, they concluded that we would not fight the West with tanks, as we do not have the forces, but we must fight subliminally. They were the authors of this term, the so-called hybrid war, which was later described in an article by Gerasimov, and it became accepted that Gerasimov is the author, but that's not entirely true. Sergun and Junin were the ones who built the tools for it. And essentially, the first tangible effectiveness and impact of using the doctrine of Sergun and Junin was, in a practical sense, in 2014, the operation in Crimea, the operation in Donbass, and here these units that were not yet fully prepared but already had their structures and were fully operational, carried out their actions. And effectively. And now, a command for Special Operations Forces is being established, which initially includes basically 3 units, essentially 2 units.
Does this diagram, which I have as the first one, help us with this or not yet?
Thank you. I sent you 2 additional ones on X. You can upload the first one. Just a moment. That 2 such units were established, but I say this is an element of the first phase of building modern special operations forces. And these units no longer had the frontline character like, for example, the special forces units subordinate to the main command, but these were already special units at the strategic level. The first of them is the so-called Senesh or sunflowers, whichever you prefer in the nomenclature of such. So, in fact, the conversations between soldiers, specifically the strategic Senesh subordinate, essentially directly to Putin, are indeed the sunflowers. And this special unit with the number 92154, the special unit with the number 92154 is quite specific because it is primarily directly subordinate to Putin, a combat part, but it also has elements within its competencies. Analytical and indeed commanding, meaning it is a unit that does not have to rely on the resources of special services to operate. And the commander of this scenario is General Mario Alexei Gao. And this is the unit, let's say, top of the top, that operates and can function in this sphere, because it not only has this effect in the framework of SAU, meaning special forces, but also SPI, which includes all actions that allow them to acquire knowledge, analyze situations, and plan operations independently of other Russian structures. The next unit that was created was the Special Purpose Center Kubyanka II, and it is structurally similar to Senesh, with the difference that it is a bit larger and, above all, lacks those analytical and intelligence elements, allowing this unit must operate independently without the support of state structures. It needs the resources provided by special services. And indeed, the Russian special units lacked support. They were like boxes without eyes and needed some intelligence and analytical support, which led to the creation of the Supreme Command of Special Operations, which has within its competencies resources from both the main directorate known as GRU, the K service, meaning cyber units, as well as the Federal Security Service and the Foreign Intelligence Service. So here, special operations of a cyber intelligence level are carried out, but also by collaborating with the Command of Special Operations Forces, kinetic actions can be performed with these two. And I will soon mention the third unit. The special units, namely Senesh and Kubianka II, but there is also a maritime operations unit, which is much smaller than the other two. I do not have exact information about their operations, however, it was established after 2014. So, it is relatively the youngest of these three, let's say, of the three strategic units, meaning Russia has one such, let's say, top of the top. A strategic level special unit and two land-air-sea units formed from Kubianka II and the Maritime Operations Unit, which can operate at the strategic level. But all the special units of the Spetsnaz, which were previously in the main intelligence directorate, that is the former GRU, were dedicated to the command of operations. And all these special brigades, probably independent special regiments or special battalions, form the resource of the commander of the Russian Special Operations Forces. Of course, elements also remained in some special units, in some armed forces. Of course, the Supreme Command of Strategic Forces has its special units which are subordinate, but the Supreme Command of Special Operations can set tasks for them, meaning those even higher. And of course, the ground forces only have reconnaissance units, as all special units have already transitioned to the Special Operations Forces. In the naval fleet, special units and reconnaissance units remained, and in the airborne troops, special and reconnaissance units also remained, because the main command leads the reconnaissance units all the time, as reconnaissance units performing reconnaissance tasks are sometimes confused with those special units, because it was born.
We can clarify something right away. Reconnaissance is carried out for military units, tactical and operational groups at the appropriate depth. And even now, in the mechanized battalion, there should already be a reconnaissance platoon. So, regarding the distance of the firepower that the battalion can employ, at least at that distance, there should be the capability for penetration and reconnaissance by this reconnaissance platoon. Building the pre-forest? Yes, to create situational awareness for one's immediate superior and all those above him. In the case of a brigade, there is at least a reconnaissance company. I would prefer to see a battalion of which such a reconnaissance company is just one of the elements. However, let's assume that it is at least a company, and here the depth to which the firepower of the brigade commander can reach, if we assume that we already have MLRS launchers, K239, and HIMARS, which will be able to reach 80 kilometers. To carry out a fire strike, while being appropriately withdrawn, so that they are not shelled by anything ugly, stupid, or the first better option, then this depth becomes not 7 to 9 kilometers, but 40-60. And for that, you need to have the appropriate equipment, some training and skills, and communication equipment as well. So, this shows what they are engaged in. Remember that the principle is that reconnaissance soldiers, if they are recognized by the enemy, cease to fulfill their most important task, which is to be, see, observe, and relay information. They must be trained well enough to neutralize such threats to their presence in the enemy formation, and after detection, to withdraw as quickly as possible and to resume, if possible, carrying out their tasks, which primarily involve silent covert observation. On the other hand, special units can conduct reconnaissance as an opportunity, but they are tasked with missions set for special units, such as detecting a high-level command post through reconnaissance. It would be good to infiltrate and eliminate it, for example. And this is the difference between reconnaissance units and special units.
Yes. So this reconnaissance element remained in the GRU, meaning they manage it. GRU, the main directorate, because the official name is the main directorate, but I will use the colloquial term GRU, and that would conclude it. So we have special units that fall under the command of Special Operations Forces, but we also have a higher command, the Supreme Command of Special Operations, which connects all special elements, namely intelligence, and special units, so that there can be an exchange of information so that the boxer is not blind, knows where to strike to achieve the opponent's knockout. This allows Russia to conduct operations below the threshold of war with all the elements they need. And now, if you could, Maciej, show the second chart. We will see what quantities are in these units. That will be very interesting. So, please take a look. And this chart shows us what the personnel looks like distributed among the individual units in terms of the command of special forces. Of course, we have the Supreme Command of Special Operations, then the Command of Special Operations Forces with the General Acoustic, then two strategic commands. Such strategic units, namely Senes and Kubianka. Of course, there is also a naval unit, and here regarding Senes, there are only 800 operators. While for the entire strategic structure, there are only 3,000 special operators.
Wait, because something muffled your sound. Can you repeat that?
As for the unit, such a strategic...
Something is still not right. Something is wrong.
Try now, maybe. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5.
No, something is cutting out with the voice right now. The internet is weak, but my upload is 95, so it's probably something on your end.
Yes.
That it's coming through. And now speak, because it's already clearly audible.
1, 2, 3, 4, 5.
Yes, it's good now.
Okay. And now, regarding the special units, the strategic ones, the Russians have a total of 3 Israel special operators with 800 directly under the command of Putin. They can be compared in terms of nomenclature of use to the American Delta, which is directly under the president and carries out strategic tasks, but there is a supreme command that oversees all units. And that command is precisely the SSO, which includes special purpose brigades, independent special purpose regiments, independent special purpose battalions, and special purpose companies. And they are, in terms of brigades, present at the level of regiments, while battalions are present at the army level, military groupings. However, in regiments and brigades, there are special battalions and companies. And the army also has one independent special company at the army level. They were frequently used in the past for the private and personal safeguarding of the commander or leader of a given army. They did not perform larger tasks, although General Flustikov changed that. And these units, special companies, also had to step out of the role of bodyguards and engage in operations. And of course, there is something new, namely volunteer corps, mercenary units, and they also fall under the command of special operations forces. And look, in the volunteer corps, we have roughly around 50,000 personnel in these brigades, regiments, and independent units. Approximately 10,000 and 3,000 personnel totaling in these special strategic units. And this roughly shows us that Russia has forces that basically, well, we are talking about 70, maybe 80,000 soldiers, which can be used below the threshold of war, because I remind you that all special operations forces, special units are not part of the armed forces of the Russian Federation. I am talking about these strategic level units, and those units that are at the brigade level, army and so on, are subordinate to, are included in the units of the armed forces of the Russian Federation. So it has units that are not units under the law of war and units that are under the law. Here is this kind of mix, a hybrid of different solutions that provide incredible flexibility in conducting operations, because Putin can assign a task to a unit that is not a strictly military unit and can carry out tasks outside the country's borders without provoking. Sorry, it will be clarified. You may notice here that it can carry out tasks with units that are not elements of the armed forces below the threshold of war and essentially not acknowledge them. This is the role of special units.
And now I think we partly see something like this in the execution of North Korea, because I do not believe that they will act as cohesive subunits of the North Korean army. They will rather appear in Russian uniforms as some element of a PMC, volunteer corps, or something like that.
Here at the very bottom.
Excuse me.
Here at the very bottom, what is in this diagram?
Exactly. Volunteer Corps, similar things. It will suddenly increase from 50 to 62,000. But most importantly, the total of this Russian Special Forces personnel, meaning well-trained, well-equipped, well-paid soldiers and operators, is around 80,000. So now I will remind you how much the Polish army counts in the land forces. It doesn't have that many. This means that, theoretically, purely comparing in a tabular manner, 1-to-1, every soldier, driver, mechanic, cook equals one Russian Special Forces soldier per penny.
At different stages in various contexts.
Of course.
Another one, or this one, just more assault and more special. Because in reality, there are only about 3,000 specialists, you could say.
Yes, these are operators. I call them operators because Special Forces soldiers are, let's say, a little lower. These are already operators. But there is another matter in all of this. Should we be afraid of it? Let's take a look. The Russians use a lot of what we mentioned here in this war, and the Ukrainians are not so afraid of it. They have trained and created so much themselves. They have units of a special nature, and they can effectively oppose these Russian specialists, and are not worse than them at all. On the contrary, in many respects, their effectiveness has been shown to be at least equal, if not better than that of the Russians. There are places where there is even an exchange of blows between the special forces of both armies. So on one hand, one might think, oh my, they have so many of those. Someone who doesn't know this would label them as commandos. It's better not to get involved at all. They'll cover us with a cap. No, it's not like that. Not everything can be revived in the right way, at the right time, in the right place. Not everyone is available. And an example of why one shouldn't be afraid of it, but rather approach it rationally, is precisely the actions of the Ukrainian military, which are dealing with these Russian special forces. After all the time.
I mean, yes, we don't know too much about special operations. A very interesting battle was over the Black Sea, where the Ukrainian special naval units played a key role, essentially driving the Black Sea fleet out of the western waters of that sea. This is very interesting overall. On the other hand, the Russians are coming back into play. Deep operations are becoming more frequent, mostly reconnaissance, because special reconnaissance is very important here. These striking successes of the Russian aviation, or missiles on certain important targets, I won't mention them here, but the Russians have many successes in this regard. Hit lifts. This is, among other things, the successes of special units, which no longer carry out kinetic actions that they can perform if the need arises. But there is always the danger of a mishap, as happened near Chernihiv recently in July of this year, when a special group was shot.
From majors, captains, and lieutenants.
Foams, everyone was writing there that it's Senes, but everyone calls it Senes, and it's not always Senes. Let's put it that way. Well, Senes probably wouldn't do that because these are not infantry units for running and special reconnaissance, but when they do operate, they operate in Europe. They have their networks. Intelligence, they have their purchase locations, they have their communication, and so on. They can carry out some diversions deeper than just in Ukraine. On the other hand, Kubianka 2, a naval operations unit, consists of units 01355 and 00317, and they could carry out such operations on Ukrainian territory. They are allocated to that level. Well, and probably in my opinion, although as I said in PS, Russian or Ukrainian is often provided in Senes, it was the Kubianka 2 operation, which specifically aimed at special reconnaissance and diversions, in particular involving operations related to the strike towards Kursk. Russian drone reconnaissance has been completely blown away from that area. A lot of the SB caught many spies, and it was necessary to rebuild the reconnaissance of that area, especially since forces were gathering there, about which the Russians did not know what, where, and when it would be carried out. Because the Ukrainians were gathering near Sumy, the Russians knew, but they did not know exactly what and where, and they needed special units there that, after the Ukrainians gathered near Sumy, the Russians knew, but they did not know exactly what and where, and they needed special units that were there. And probably Kubyanka was there, along with one of those reconnaissance special groups, which was tasked with infiltration and disrupting the command system as they were attacking telecommunication targets to let in some potential service K, which I mentioned, meaning one of the elements building this community within the Supreme Command of Special Operations. And here the SBU detected this group, and they simply did not surrender. They wanted to surrender. The Ukrainians wanted to capture them alive because it would be very good material. Even for exchange, however, the group that was encircled was completely killed in their own fights or tore themselves apart, as there were also such descriptions of the battle. Maciej, do you know anything more about this?
No, I don't know more about it, but this only speaks to one thing. Indeed, the mental preparation of these soldiers was such that they were determined that they could not allow themselves to be captured. Well, this is the level of mental preparation of soldiers, which is not common, and if it occurred during a special military operation, not during war, it means that their level of motivation was very, very high.
The remaining special units, I call them heavy Specnaz, that is already Specnaz, I call it frontline. It also falls under the Special Operations Forces, but it operates more at the front, acting as assault units, often conducting night raids to penetrate the group and carry out operations within that front zone. And of course, there are reconnaissance units, but they fall under the main command. But this is also the very heavy Specnaz that is used as a regular assault unit for storming buildings or heavy elements such as tanks.
But these are the same units that simultaneously maintain order in the rear. Because let's remember at the beginning, after the outbreak of war, for example, in Zaporizhia, there were many sabotage and partisan actions. And they were suppressed over time. There was no leniency there. And that's why the Guard did not respond quickly, but rather the special units assigned to each general military army, from what I hear,
Maciej, Spetsnaz Guards.
Not only that, there were also specific units, for example, in Zaporizhia, where the operation you called the phalanx or shield wall was prepared. In the rear, there were two special forces brigades. I would call them general military.
It depends on where the Guard is responsible for force protection and rear operations. If so, then this specialization was probably assigned to the Guards during the operation and to the anti-terrorism center, which they call, that is responsible for this area of responsibility. It happens, especially since at the very beginning, the Guard supported military operations with its maneuver units.
How it ended for them and they withdrew to the rear.
Yes, so it was just like that, it could have been, but as the main provider, planner, and they were only there for the duration of the operation, probably to significantly increase the potential.
But in any case, this type of special forces under the Guard essentially suppressed 90% of all guerrilla activities in the immediate rear of the front. Unfortunately.
Yes, and they are getting better at it. But we can do a completely different episode about the Guard.
So maybe we will. The Guard itself is, of course, also an interesting thing because you can always compare it to what it does. The American National Guard, what we have on our side. But one can look for those similarities. However, let us remember that the Guard is, above all, in my opinion, a formation that is meant to guarantee the existence and durability of power and the system of power.
Yes, it is such a formation. These are also Russian special units. They are not ordinary ones. As it was said before, they are subordinate to the GRU. Special units are subordinate to the GRU. Now it is not so obvious. Of course, the GRU participates within the framework of the Supreme Command of Special Operations, and there are specialists, or even probably one of the deputies, or even the chief could be there, because the whole problem lies in the structure that it is difficult to attach it anywhere, because there are both civil and military services, cyber services, Special Operations Command, military elements, and non-military ones. And this gives Russia a very large capability. Primarily, this command has a great ability to carry out very broad operations from a small war or even a larger one. As you pointed out, their number of around 80,000 means they can easily head to the Baltic countries. Because let's remember that these assault battalions, especially the special assault units, also have heavy weaponry. There will also be tanks found in the meantime.
Yes, I just remembered that not everyone knows about it, but just like during the PRL, there were created.
Not to mention the Volunteer Corps, which has tanks, artillery, even aviation in its ranks.
The point is that even a Polish anti-terrorist company at the provincial command level, if needed, could have a tank. It was simply easy to plan certain things during the times of the People's Army of Poland and the then Ministry of Internal Affairs. And these patterns, after all, came to us from the East. So it should be automatically assumed that any type of equipment present in the army of a given country, especially Russia, is and can be at any moment within reach and available for use by special forces.
Exactly. That's why I believe that the Russians are investing, especially since the new position of its creator essentially strengthens the role of these structures under Putin. And in my opinion, Maciej, this will be a structure dedicated to fighting against us, because I don't think the Russians will try any war excursions, not yet, but actions below the threshold of war. With those individuals who are prepared and already tested in Ukraine will be attempted, if not already being attempted to a lesser or greater extent, to influence us, these sabotage attempts, to test our system, how it reacts, whether we can detect such manipulations, because sometimes such sabotage, which is not really sabotage, is just to spam our counterintelligence capabilities so that another group can carry out its other tasks. This is in the Russian style.
Yes, I fully agree.
Success is not always a success, because sometimes this success is given to us by our opponent, so that we simply allocate our resources to this projected success, rather than the one we need to secure as part of counterintelligence operations.
I mean, let's remember the statement of Remy Farquad. Many of you will die, but it is a sacrifice I am willing to make. And special units on the Russian chessboard are something that can be sacrificed if necessary for a higher purpose.
It is a one-time event, at least in the nomenclature of the Russians. The probability of the return of a reconnaissance sabotage group from these special brigades, of this heavy special forces, as they call it in quotes, is around 30%.
You see for yourselves. So let's move a little bit for now to a broader spectrum, showing something you showed a long time ago. Generally speaking, what does the diagram of the Russian armed forces look like in all of this?
Well, this is actually my first diagram, because later I made a slightly clearer one. However, the point was to find out where the various elements are after all the reforms of the armed forces. And here a very important thing is that the commands, military districts, ceased to be commands. They became at the department level
Administrative generals.
Yes. These are military administration units, equivalent to departments in the Ministry of Defense. However, commands as such, of course, there are staffs, etc. But these are just resources. There, people are only training, people are only preparing, while the staffs are being organized. These grouping staffs, or operational strategic level staffs, are created on an ad hoc basis We have this in the example of Ukraine. That is, there is a special military operations staff. There are grouping staffs of troops, and where there are already physical army and corps staffs and other independent units. And now in this way, Russia has remodeled its command system, moving away from the territorial significance for military units, which means that Russia is preparing more for offensive operations rather than defensive ones, because this territorial structure of staffs was rather a typically defensive structure of that unit, as these staffs train solely for the specifics of a given area. Now, the commanders of these districts have to prepare people and staffs for work, and they can fight in the eastern direction as well as in the southern, northern, or western direction. And all this staff resource from the eastern district to Moscow, and especially Leningrad, is to be ready for creating staffs and being prepared for rotation, because a very important element is the rotation of people in the staff. What has essentially saved and is currently saving Russian aggression, because the Russians have this resource of staff officers, while the Ukrainians do not. It's not about a physical person, and Maciej has also said this many times, but about a person who has the ability to plan combat at a specific level and within a structure, and this is not acquired overnight. It is learned over many years, and this quality of long-term training has been preserved among the Russians.
And here I will now make a local time insertion from the Ukrainian front, from the Ukrainian side. 59. The brigade responsible for defense in the Pokrovsk direction turned out to be a 32-year-old Z brigade commander. As for me, an untested, inexperienced rookie. But let's assume he could be some kind of genius, a strategist, or at least tactical. Unfortunately, he was not and could not handle commanding 18 battalions. Until recently, he was commanding his 5 or 6, and then he received twice as many from different units. He could not effectively coordinate, plan, or synchronize certain things, responding as a staff, which at that moment, from a weak brigade staff, was supposed to be responsible for a 45-kilometer section, 18 battalions, which is a section larger than what a division normally takes on in defense, but he was supposed to command forces essentially of a division. I don't know yet how it was with artillery support, but there was some Ukrainian artillery brigade somewhere in the rear. He and his team couldn't handle it. Neither the co-staff nor he could handle it, and that's why it ended that way in Solidowy. It ended that way in Hernik. Someone made the decision to send, or rather to appoint someone so young, without experience, as the commander of this brigade. And he didn't have, well, maybe if he were a genius, if he had a really good chief of staff and staff officers who know their job and could, how to put it, to translate his youthful fantasy into the proper level of orders, commands, coordination, planning, maybe it would have worked out somehow, but unfortunately it didn't. And it ended very sadly at this moment. It was a local and temporal digression, but unfortunately very specific. And it is sad that over these almost 3 years, it has not been possible to identify such, let's call it that, or at least we don't know anything about it, that it was possible to carry such a team of young officers who proved themselves to such an extent that they could be entrusted with command at a higher level. Here, the Ukrainians definitely did not shine, while sometimes I would even call them untrained but conditioned in certain matters related to planning, directing, and commanding. Russian staff officers, even if forcibly torn away at that moment from a glass of something stronger, did their job properly and on time. And unfortunately, they developed, to some extent, a certain kind of advantage in favor of Russia.
This is also about fatigue. It is a longer fight, and there needs to be rotation. How many are you saying? 19 battalions were. This is even more than a division has when it comes to management. And there, after all, we still have the staffs. Besides the division staff, there should probably be 2-3 brigade staffs that also relieve the division of certain coordination lower down then. So, well then, here, let's say that the operational freedom
that saved the Ukrainians during the first stage of the war was fine, but in a classical war of attrition without effective command. Of course, logistics and a system for restoring combat capabilities, because here too the Russians made significant progress. Well, it will be difficult for the Ukrainians to maintain themselves on the battlefield at an equal level, even if the soldiers at the tactical level are better than those driven by bayonets, former prisoners who have been made soldiers. Still, the same amount of ammunition must be used on that former prisoner as on a guy who is well trained. And by the way, one has to risk the lives of their soldiers who are also well trained, and that also costs. Thus, the Russians have made much greater progress, and in my opinion, they have drawn many more conclusions than the Ukrainians.
Unfortunately, yes, but there was also allowed for greater operability at a lower level instead of complete authoritarianism in certain matters. So this initiative began to emerge a bit.
But that was still in the airborne units or in the mercenary units. The Russians had that initiative. They were capable, but it was not widespread. That is a fact.
And now there is such an observation made by colleagues from the drones. Why have drones become such a wonderful, at least temporarily, remedy for everything? Because the nature of war has changed. We have moved from maneuver warfare to positional warfare, in which these drones can serve as a substitute for artillery, providing a permanent situational picture, etc. It could turn out that they are not so mega and so super necessary if the war had a more maneuverable character.
I do not agree with you, Maciej.
But I am saying what they themselves say. Wait, the drone operators themselves, that is why. This is the time for them now, when they are the most important. On the other hand, when the character was maneuverable, it was precisely the Ukrainian commanders who coped better, with the entry into the trenches and so on, where there must be routine and repetition in planning, directing, and so on, preparing certain things instead of permanent improvisation. The Russians began to win again. These are two phenomena. If it turns out that this war in some area will come out of the trenches and start to be more maneuverable again, it may turn out that drones will lose significance there. Why the time of their launch, release, the range they can reach when you do not know where the enemy is in the end? And even reconnaissance drones, they also have their limitations, etc. These are conclusions from people who operate drones there, on the spot.
But then there are drones you see of a different level, and they need to be developed. That's why the Russians are entering drone brigades. Moreover, the Ukrainians entered earlier, but the Ukrainians are more focused on these drone brigades of one type, namely that tactical type. On the other hand, the Russians are entering brigades. Here we will show the structure of one of the brigades. They are entering brigades that include both tactical level drones. There are currently 2 battalions. In addition, in this battalion, there are 2 such drones, with 2 companies responsible for the lowest drones, namely the loitering munitions, the kamikaze drones, but also the loitering ammunition, and of course 1 heavier company that is responsible for the tactical but further area, and of course some heavy company that is responsible for the roads, more operational strategic drones. And the Russians, they are entering this area with various systems at every level to ensure it is properly secured. On the other hand, the Ukrainians have brigades dedicated to one type of drones, for example, exclusively tactical ones, and they primarily support operations. This brigade, Grom, which is built on the basis of volunteer units of Kaskad, those Russian drones, well, has this. It can operate these drones at the tactical, operational, and strategic levels.
It reminds me of the organization of so-called mixed air divisions. A mixed air division was something that only the Russians had. There were, let's say, shelves of fighters that were supposed to protect bombers and attack aircraft. So this division specifically had 3 types of aircraft. Meanwhile, the West had units. Tactical groups that were monothematic. fighter wing, bomber wing, support aircraft wing, and their cooperation had to be organized differently. Meanwhile, the commander of the Russian, then still Soviet mixed air division, immediately mixed things as he needed. And I believe that to some extent, this has passed down here to the organization of drones because they have all the necessary levels, all the weight measures, and various types of armament, and they are able, based on how observations are conducted, to know the principle. You conduct observations further and further from yourself, because if you look 5 kilometers ahead and your opponent comes out from the trench in front of you and you don't notice him, then it will be bad for you. And on this very principle, that they are able to look deep from the tip of their nose, this type of brigade was created. We will see which system proves to be more effective as we will go a little further down. Something we have already discussed regarding the reorganization of company and battalion level units in various types of troops. But now let's return to this brigade and please finish your thought, Machku.
Here, another very important factor is this Rubicon, which is the training center, meaning that besides this, the brigade also has its center that teaches. So it gains experience and immediately translates it into learning to ensure that institutional memory is preserved. In addition, there are battalions, an electronic warfare battalion, which as we know is critically important. By the way, you have experienced, Maciej, that without electronic warfare, one does not approach at all.
One does not approach the power.
So here, at the brigade level, there is even a battalion. Sometimes battalions are only at the army level in Russia, but here there is a dedicated electronic warfare battalion at the brigade level. However, the analytical battalion or groups is very important, particularly the intelligence analytical battalion, but more analytical, meaning it involves a team of people who can analyze the imagery from these drones and make appropriate decisions. This element is not just about having someone in the staff who deals with it, but it must be a whole team of appropriate specialists who can analyze spectra in this magnetic space, analyze imagery, and all other elements related to target designation, as well as the safe operation of drone-led operations. This is exactly what the subunit, the battalion responsible for it, deals with. And of course, logistics, meaning communication, and the command support battalion. Of course, it is also important to note that in every, at least in this independent element, there is a subunit for the repair or modernization of drones, because on the battlefield, these drones undergo workshop modernization, being adapted to the current conditions imposed by the enemy. In this case, if the Ukrainians use some jamming means, then the Russians, upon detecting such capabilities, try to modify these workshop companies, as I call them. Drone companies are a very important element of the battalions, but also of the independent companies that carry out independent operations. I'm talking about the heavier one. It also has a subunit that deals with servicing, like more servicing, because these heavy drones must have a small airfield to take off, so there also needs to be an appropriate number of technicians to secure that. Thus, this brigade can carry out tasks on a very wide front and in various directions with equally great effectiveness, or operate all its forces for the benefit of some unit. Where there are cascades, this brigade can be found. Of course, the grouping of General Mordowitchev at the center, there are a lot of them, and the eastern grouping of General Semchik, but one battalion was also seen and was carrying out operations towards Kursk, and here from the direction of Rilsk it was deployed and conducted actions towards Ukrainian units.
I will now throw in some findings on how the Ukrainians do it, because the Ukrainians approach this differently. First of all, now descending to the operational level in the forces, let's call it primarily armored and mechanized. We mentioned that reconnaissance drone sections have appeared at the company command level, where in some more assault subunits, drones are also assigned at the platoon level.
The Russians are the same.
Yes, we are now talking about the Russians. Meanwhile, the Ukrainians approach this differently. Ukrainians at the infantry battalion level do not assign this permanently. There are no drones in the companies or in the platoons, among other things, due to the need for intensive repairs. modernizations, modifications, and even productions, because you can also make certain things from several wrecked ones, or you do it, or they order some equipment themselves or print certain elements in 3D and create something new. And it cannot go below the battalion level where they can be a bit pulled back and not be on the front edge. To all of this, it is never the case, according to them, that the entire battalion is deployed in the field with its 3, at least, companies. They always fight with fewer, something is in the back, and drones, tasks, and a possible amount of what they can use for something are assigned to those fighting companies or even platoons if necessary. These are FPV drones with anti-tank weapons, for example, and so on. They stated that they do not go below the battalion level as such. Indeed, some units of commanders organize drones for reconnaissance themselves. But this is their private initiative. Indeed, some units of commanders organize drones for observation themselves. But this is their private initiative. However, structurally, it has stopped at the battalion level, where it is actually one platoon, which consists of at least 6 operators. Each has an appropriate number of drones for what they do. They most often operate in 3-person sections. More on this topic will be in the material we are finishing preparing, a compendium in this area regarding dronization, where these Ukrainian experiences are also described in detail along with the structure of it all. This will be an opportunity to get acquainted with something like this, but as you can see, there are 2 paths. We will see which of them will be more rational. But the most important thing is that each of these 2 fighting armies does it according to their own needs and specifications, and according to their tactics, according to their specifications, according to their tactics. So it may not be entirely possible to compare all of this. However, the most visible will simply be the effect on the battlefield. And I think we will go by that.
The current effect is such that per kilometer of the front, on average, there are between 50 to 80 drone flights per day. So many times a kilometer line has been crossed by some unmanned reconnaissance or strike vehicle.
One side or both?
I beg your pardon? One side.
One side. So you can see for yourselves. And the issue of operator exploitation is also important because of this. Ukrainians divide their operators into daytime and nighttime.
Well, the same goes for the Russians. The same.
Absolutely. Besides that, there are also drones that not only operate with expensive warheads, thermal imaging, and so on, but there are also drones that use, for example, residual light cameras, much cheaper to acquire, simpler to operate. And this is exactly what the Russians are currently focusing on, as they have greater trouble with warheads and thermal cameras. That's how it looks at the moment. And all of this also has a special significance for many people, although it has truly settled completely under the proverbial military roofs. And it is currently the standard of military everyday life. The most important thing has changed, which is the ability to observe the opponent at all times in such a way that you can see what they are doing and respond more quickly to their actions. In the past, this was not the case. You had to use other methods, often being blind and deaf. Now, thanks to these various types of drones, this situation has changed dramatically, which forces a new approach to various things. Would you, for example, risk organizing a departure area at such previously regulated distances from the front edge, Makik? Because I wouldn't either. It's simply asking for trouble.
Neither would I. These standards among the Russians have also changed significantly.
But not for us. We still have a doctrine that has stopped at this point.
Yes, but I will have one more debate with you here. This ubiquitous electronic warfare is actually not ubiquitous. These drones fly by, and they are not necessarily being jammed as much as we think. The fact is that drone operators, when it comes to strikes, can be compared to, it's like throwing darts at a target. Once jammers are used from a certain altitude. Effectiveness can vary because from a certain altitude, if jamming is used, the drone simply flies towards the target like a brick in intelligence, and it either hits or misses. However, when it comes to strike drones, these jammers indeed make it difficult for drone operators to hit their targets. But the situation is completely different when it comes to reconnaissance drones. They fly much higher, and the jamming system does not reach them, because if you want to jam at high altitudes, you need to use very powerful jamming equipment, which then becomes a target for artillery, as it is not a silent device, in the sense that it is not loud, but it simply shines electromagnetically like a Christmas tree on passive reconnaissance sensors of electronic warfare systems. But these reconnaissance drones present the worst situation because they fly high and, with good optoelectronics, provide the awareness you mentioned, macierge, allowing for combat management and fire engagement management, but that is in this alternative. Artillery, well, as I said, with these drones, the situation may be that there is jamming low to the ground, and here these drones may have a problem, but at higher altitudes they often perform better. That is why Ukrainians, but also Russians, hunt for those high-flying drones, which are engaged in aerial duels, drone versus drone, in order to shoot down the reconnaissance platform, especially the reconnaissance ones.
And it has been heard recently that Russians have started using a camera facing backward to conduct observations. But the question is whether one operator can monitor their rear hemisphere and, if necessary, perform evasive maneuvers to avoid being shot down, as these are the larger, more valuable and more expensive drones. So the simplest thing is to install something that allows you to observe what is happening behind. And this is how everything looks at the moment. This war has a different character than previous ones. Certain things might not have happened if it hadn't penetrated so deeply into the trenches currently, which forced a change in many military usage concepts. And it makes very broad use of everything that has appeared new and modern in technologies, and it will be no different. Frequency changes of various types of flying equipment are so frequent that currently such so-called REBS, which do not have the ability to scale and match the necessary frequencies to those used at a given time on a given section of Russian equipment, unfortunately, they are no longer effective. And when talking to the smallest Ukrainians, we ask, what is so torn up here? Is it ordinary? Is it some artillery? No. Some rebuy operate in such a way that the range of this interaction is not very far from the vehicle on which it is installed. It's a few meters, and sometimes literally in the last segment, this drone most often has self-destruction. If a drone loses orientation, the Russians have started to install some self-destruction elements. They detonate, and it causes some damage, but it did not kill the crew in that vehicle. And as we discussed and what was mentioned from Ukraine, one does not approach the front line without a device. And there are various types of antennas, sometimes even several. The roof is the place where jamming devices are located. Unfortunately, for drones with fiber optics at this moment, no remedy exists, except for flying knives. We'll see how it goes. But this war teaches us a lot, and very quickly. At least many conclusions are being drawn by the armies of other countries. Americans, French, British, the British have even started to buy Ukrainian solutions in the field of drones and drone management, because that is also important. However, I don't see much in this regard for now. To put it more strongly and bluntly, I hope that something concrete will move in this matter?
Our command still does not see the need for an extensive drone network at the level of our army. In my opinion, this is a bit of a mistake because assuming that electronic warfare will be available everywhere is not the case. Here, electronic warfare is not applicable to everything. Sometimes it's good to have your own drones to push those operators away from the front line because it's a reconnaissance tool that you need for information. And you have it, it flies, and you have it, right? And imagine if you want to plan reconnaissance and ask your superior for reconnaissance information. Before he plans it, before you get it, and so on. And here this awareness, that's why the Russians mostly have those drones at the company level. They are not strike drones. They are rarely that. What are they?
These are drones flying at a distance between you and a maximum of 7 to 10 kilometers.
Not even up to 5 kilometers. If it's 3 to 5, it serves not for reconnaissance, but sometimes for coordinating one's own actions. Indeed. Although in various Russian descriptions it says that these drones should not fly over your position because they betray you and so on. But commanders, especially when they have to push this untrained army forward, sometimes use it simply for coordinating their own actions to make use of it. But it gives the Russian commander at the company or battalion level that he quickly receives information and knows what to do, knows how to react, knows how to form in relation to the threat, or knows how to approach, because he will find such a place that you might not even find during a foot reconnaissance sometimes, because you won't get through it as quickly as you would fly over it with a drone. I have seen videos showing how Russian commanders observe the terrain, checking if they can approach from that side, but not by themselves, just for the needs of the drone being sent, of course. In the end, he will probably go there to see if the terrain is marshy, if it is possible to drive an infantry vehicle in, or not, but this initial reconnaissance is done with the help of a drone. Otherwise, Machiage, the departure area, the protection of the departure area, meaning patrolling the threatened area, you no longer send a soldier on patrol, but you build a QRF unit that reacts, and a team of drone operators who rotate and patrol. A much larger area and more efficient than if you deployed 1 million sensors there. And that somehow consumed that much military resources, while the soldier can rest, and only direct protection is maintained near the vehicles, at the resting place, while at the forward outposts. Drones can do this, observing the area.
Another simple example of application, instead of a single combat vehicle that goes as a patrol vehicle at the front, in the leading patrol, which is the rest of the platoon, this platoon will feel better if they all travel together. And instead of that single vehicle, 1 or 2 drones will fly ahead, which will be replaced every 20-40 minutes, depending on the situation, with others that will fly and safely move in front of the marching column.
That's why I assume the establishment of battalion tactical groups equipped with a larger resource of drones, which you are talking about, and operating in this way. Additionally, an example is how the Marine Corps prepared a fire ambush on the 82nd Air Assault Brigade of Ukraine, where 2 BTRs fired upon over a company of troops that were moving through the formation. Yes, and it shows that this film, which shows how the commander of that company directed the fire of his PTRs, or the company, it could be a platoon, because we only saw 2 PTRs in action in that fragment. But what those 2 PTRs did, and how the attack was synchronized on that very quickly moving column, which passed very deeply, that it was already there. Observed from afar by the commander, he could prepare these general tasks with smaller resources, because when such a subunit is moving, you also need to prepare a larger subunit, and here he determined, I will give 2 batteries and that will be enough for me, so assigning the task to these soldiers, 2 soldiers, is easier than to 5 or 10 vehicles that have to carry it out. Yes, it's also about speed, understanding, and the quality of executing that general task. These are things that are immeasurable, in my opinion, measurable on the battlefield, but immeasurable for people who are up high and don't have to, plow the ground in that way. Sometimes a commander must have imagination. Every commander must have imagination, but they must also have knowledge, and imagination cannot replace the actual picture of the battlefield.
That's right. So this is also a pointer for our decision makers should really think hard about their approach to the necessity, in my opinion, of having and using various types of drones, at least at the battalion level and below, if it is to be used from the battalion in the Ukrainian model, or even at the company level, if it were a model more similar to what the Russians are currently doing, because the situational awareness that can be gained from this translates into potentially fewer own losses, both in equipment and in personnel, and that is always invaluable. And with this optimistic note, I hope we conclude our meeting today. If you liked it, I encourage you to like, comment, share, and subscribe to the channel. Captain Lisowski ad management, channel support, every way described on the channel. Don't forget that Maciej Korowaj publishes a lot on his Twitter account. I encourage you to follow it. Also, support his activities. He is a sought-after specialist. He is invited to various media, so you see him quite often because his analyses are complete and comprehensive. I congratulate you on your approach to work, Maciej, and I wish you continued positive reactions to your work. Oh, that's what I'll call it. And we have new concepts and similar things to discuss ahead of us. So I sincerely thank you, Maciej, for the time you dedicated to us. So we say goodbye. Colonel Maciej Korowaj.
Thank you for the meeting. Thank you for the invitation.
Maciej Kapitan Lisowski. Until we hear from each other, see you. Bye.